Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're diving into the Rohingya crisis today. We've got a really interesting mix of sources, YouTube videos, documentaries, even like a geography channel, all trying to explain this really, really complicated situation.
Yeah,
What's the mission for our deep dive today? I think it's to help you understand, you know, not just what's happening, but why it's so important.
I think you're absolutely right. And, one thing that jumps out from these sources is just how much the Rohingya crisis is like a puzzle with missing pieces.
Hmm.
There are so many perspective and like so many layers of history to try to unravel here.
Okay, so let's start putting those puzzle pieces together then.
Okay,
First things first, who are the Rohingya?
right.
I've heard the term, but I bet a lot of people listening are still a little unclear.
Yeah, the Rohingya are a Muslim minority group, and they mostly live in Rakhine State in Myanmar.
Okay.
Now, their history in the region, it goes back centuries,
Hmm.
but the Myanmar government, well, they don't recognize them as citizens.
So they're essentially stateless. That's a huge part of the problem here, right?
It is, yeah. Myanmar's government considers them illegal immigrants from Bangladesh,
Hmm.
which is a key factor in this whole crisis. They're denied basic rights, access to health care, education,
Wow.
all of that, and it makes them incredibly vulnerable.
It's almost like they're being erased.
Yeah,
And it's not just a recent thing either.
right.
Several of the documentaries highlighted, decades of this systematic discrimination and persecution.
Absolutely, and we see these repeating patterns of violence and displacement that keep forcing the Rohingya to flee. Like one example that really stood out to me was a 1978 military operation. It was called Operation Dragon King,
Wow.
and it forced a huge wave of Rohingya refugees into Bangladesh.
And that was just the beginning, wasn't it? The documentaries mentioned, similar crackdowns in the 1990s and then again in 2012.
Each event just added another layer of trauma and desperation.
Right.
Each time more Rohingya were displaced, and it just made the situation more and more complex.
Which brings us to 2017.
Right.
And what the UN called a textbook example of ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
The sources described, widespread killings, rape, entire villages being burned to the ground.
The brutality of the Myanmar military's clearance operations is undeniable. And actually, satellite images corroborate the widespread destruction of Rohingya homes and villages. Hundreds of thousands were forced to flee for their lives.
One documentary told the story of Asatara Begum. She's a young woman who's fleeing during this time.
Yeah.
And she was being relocated to Pasan Char.
Okay.
It's an island in the Bay of Bengal.
Uh-huh.
But it sounds like that's pretty controversial.
It is. Bangladesh presents it as a solution to overcrowding in the refugee camps.
Right.
But human rights groups are really concerned.
Yeah.
They say the island is super vulnerable to cyclones and basic services are limited.
Wow.
It's a tough choice,
Yeah.
Do you stay in an overcrowded, dangerous camp or get moved to an isolated, potentially dangerous island?
So where did that leave the Rohingya? What options do they even have at this point?
Well, over 1 million Rohingya refugees are now living in camps in Bangladesh, primarily in Cox's Bazar.
Yeah.
And the conditions there, they're really dire. Overcrowding, limited access to basic services, and they're completely dependent on humanitarian aid.
It's hard to imagine having to rebuild your life, in a place that doesn't want you, and knowing that returning home might not even be an option.
And on top of all of that, the fear of repatriation to Myanmar is constant. There's just no guarantee of safety or citizenship if they return.
So they're essentially trapped in limbo.
They are.
It's just heartbreaking.
It is.
Some of the sources really highlighted the psychological toll of all this.
Right.
The constant fear, the loss of loved ones, the uncertainty.
Yeah.
It's got to be incredibly difficult to process.
One video shared the story of a psychologist who works in the Cox's Bazar camps.
Okay.
And he was talking about how the trauma from, past events like those military crackdowns we talked about, it can be easily triggered,
Wow.
leading to kind of recurring trauma for these people. Imagine living with that constant weight on your shoulders.
That's a really good point. It makes you wonder how anyone can even function under those circumstances. But then there are stories like Noor Kabir,
Right.
the poet who teaches children in the camps.
Yeah.
It sounds like he's trying to instill hope, give them something to hold on to.
Exactly. And his story really underscores the resilience of the Rohingya people.
Yeah.
Even in the middle of unimaginable suffering, they're striving to learn, to create, to maintain some sense of normalcy. And it's not just about survival, it's about preserving their culture and identity.
But isn't it dangerous for them to speak out?
It is.
I remember a video that talked about Rohingya citizen journalists, people like Roansa,
Yeah.
who are risking their lives to document what's happening inside Myanmar.
That's right. These individuals are incredibly courageous. They're operating in an environment where, speaking the truth can be deadly. And they're relying on social media, hidden networks of reporters, snubbling photos and videos out as evidence.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
It brings up the double-edged sword of social media.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, it allows the Rohingya to share their stories with the world.
Right.
But on the other hand, we know it's been used to spread hateful propaganda against them.
Yes, it's a disturbing paradox. Several sources mentioned Facebook specifically, as a platform that's been used to spread anti-Rohingya hate speech and even incite violence.
Wow.
It's a reminder of how technology can be weaponized and the responsibility that comes with having such a powerful platform.
So while the Rohingya are trying to use social media to get their message out,
Right.
they're also fighting against a wave of misinformation and hate speech.
Yeah.
That's a tough battle to fight.
It really is, and it adds another layer of complexity to this already incredibly challenging situation.
Okay, so we've talked about the Rohingya themselves, their history, their struggles.
Right.
But what about the rest of the world? How has the international community responded to this crisis?
Well, there's been a lot of condemnation of the Myanmar government's actions. But when it comes to concrete action,
Yeah,
not so much.
really.
Several sources pointed to the UN Security Council's inability to take any meaningful action.
Why is that? Is it because of those veto powers that certain countries have?
You hit the nail on the head. China and Russia have used their veto power to block any significant action against Myanmar.
So it seems like geopolitics often trumps human rights.
Unfortunately,
It's a sad reality, but it explains a lot.
it does.
There has been some financial aid provided to Bangladesh
Right.
to help support the refugees.
Yes.
But it's nowhere near enough to meet the overwhelming needs.
Not even close.
And what about the International Criminal Court? There was mention of an investigation into the crimes against the Rohingya.
Yeah.
Could that provide some hope for justice?
Possibly. It's certainly a step in the right direction, but the ICC process is notoriously slow, and the outcome is far from certain.
Yeah.
It is a long process. And while we wait for justice to play out, the Rohingya remain trapped in this, well, kind of impossible situation.
Yeah.
So let's talk about their future, or the lack thereof, I guess. Repatriation to Myanmar just seems unlikely without some major changes.
You mean, like guarantees of safety, basic rights, citizenship,
Yeah.
the things that they've been denied for so long?
Exactly, and resettlement in other countries is extremely limited.
Right.
It's a long shot for most refugees, so they're essentially stuck.
Yeah.
Bangladesh is overwhelmed, and they're looking for solutions that don't involve permanent integration.
It's like everyone's passing the buck.
Yeah.
And the Rohingya are the ones who suffer. One documentary highlighted the rising tensions in Bangladesh,
Yeah.
with communities near the camps feeling the strain on resources.
It's a complex situation for sure, and to understand it fully, I think we need to dig a little deeper into the religious dynamics at play here.
That's a good point. Most of the sources focused on the Rohingya as a Muslim minority
Right.
in a predominantly Buddhist country.
Right.
But I get the feeling there's more to it than that.
You're right, there is one video highlighted the persecution of Christians in Myanmar, specifically the Karen and Kachin people.
Okay.
They've also faced violence and displacement, often at the hands of the military.
So it's not just a Muslim versus Buddhist issue.
Not at all. The situation is way more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
The sources we have, they point to a long history of religious tensions in Myanmar, and, British colonial rule actually made things worse.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, one video explained how the British brought in large numbers of Muslims from India during their rule.
Okay.
And this created friction in a predominantly Buddhist country, adding fuel to existing tensions.
So it's almost like the seeds of division were planted way back then.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. And those seeds, coupled with the military junta's promotion of Burman Buddhist nationalism, created a fertile ground for the kind of persecution we see today.
It was really toxic mix.
It is.
Historical grievances, religious intolerance, political opportunism.
Yeah.
It's no wonder things have escalated to this point.
And unfortunately, that intolerance has kind of seeped into society.
Right.
One documentary featured a Rohingya grandmother who talked about how Muslims were denied jobs and opportunities that were given to Buddhists. She remembered a time when ID cards were given and taken away at random.
Wow.
And travel was restricted based on your religion.
That's just so blatant and unfair.
It is.
It's not even trying to hide the discrimination.
Exactly. And these firsthand accounts, they really drive home the systemic nature of the problem.
Yeah.
These aren't isolated incidents,
Yeah.
It's about deeply ingrained policies and practices that target an entire group of people and solely based on their religion.
It's chilling. And one thing that really stood out to me was the role of Buddhist monks in spreading this hatred. A few sources mentioned a figure named Akshen Warafu,
Right.
known for his anti-Muslim rhetoric.
Wirathu is a very controversial figure. Some even call him the face of Buddhist terror. His speeches are just full of hate speech, often inciting violence against Muslims. It's a reminder that religious extremism can exist anywhere,
Yeah,
in any faith.
and that extremism has found a new platform in the digital age.
Yes.
We already talked about social media's role in spreading propaganda, but some sources went even further.
Yeah,
They described how platforms like Facebook were used to incite violence,
right.
even calling for the killing of Rohingya.
It's horrifying, but unfortunately not surprising.
Right.
One video detailed how anti-Rohingya messages went viral on Facebook, and the platform was actually used to coordinate attacks on Rohingya communities.
Wow, it raises some serious questions about these social media giants, doesn't it? What responsibility do they have to prevent their platforms from being used to, spread hate and incite violence?
It's a huge ethical dilemma, and honestly one they're still grappling with.
Yeah.
It's clear they played a role in amplifying the hatred against the Rohingya.
It's a reminder that even in the digital age, words have power.
They do.
They can be used to inspire,
Right.
but they can also be used to destroy.
Yeah, and it's incredibly frustrating that even with all the evidence of atrocities, there are still people who deny what happened to the Rohingya.
Yeah.
Denial is a powerful force.
Right?
One documentary showed an interview with a monk who claimed the Rohingya were burning down their own homes,
What?
and that the ethnic cleansing was a fabrication.
That's just absurd.
It is.
Like they're trying to rewrite history
Right.
to erase the suffering of an entire people.
It's a classic tactic.
Yeah.
Deny, minimize, and shift the blame.
Right.
It's a way to avoid responsibility and accountability. But as more evidence comes to light, as international bodies like the International Court of Justice make their rulings, those denials become harder to maintain.
It's like trying to hold back a flood.
Oh.
And what about Aung San Suu Kyi? She was once hailed as a human rights icon, a symbol of hope for Myanmar.
Yeah.
But several sources criticized her for downplaying the Rohingya crisis and defending the military.
It's a tragic fall from grace. She's been accused of prioritizing her own political power over the rights of the Rohingya people. It's a reminder that even those who seem like heroes can be corrupted by power and nationalism.
It is. It's a sobering thought. So we've covered the horrors of the Rohingya crisis.
Right.
The complex historical and religious factors involved.
Yeah.
The failures of social media and the lack of effective action from the international community. It's pretty overwhelming, honestly.
It is.
Is there any hope for the Rohingya? What are the possible solutions?
That's the question everyone's asking. The ruling by the International Court of Justice was a step towards justice and accountability,
Okay.
but it's only the beginning.
Okay, so the International Court of Justice ruling is a good starting point, I guess?
Yeah.
But what else needs to happen? What does real change actually look like in this situation?
Well, for starters, the international community needs to keep the pressure on Myanmar. They need to create conditions that allow the Rohingya to return home safely and with dignity.
And that means, granting them citizenship, ensuring their safety, giving them access to basic services.
Right.
It's a long list.
It is.
And honestly, it seems like a lot to ask given Myanmar's history.
You're not wrong. It's a big ask, but it's not impossible.
Okay.
Targeted economic sanctions against those responsible for the atrocities, that could be effective, and continued support for the refugees in Bangladesh is crucial.
So basically, we need a combination of pressure and support,
Yeah,
like a carrot and a stick approach.
exactly. But ultimately, it comes down to political will.
Right.
The world needs to decide that the Rohingya crisis is unacceptable and then act accordingly.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this.
It is.
It's such a huge problem, and progress seems so slow.
Right.
What can, ordinary people do to make a difference?
That's a question we get a lot, and it's an important one.
Yeah.
It can feel pretty helpless watching these things unfold from so far away.
Right.
But honestly, awareness is a powerful tool.
Hmm.
Just talking about the Rohingya crisis, sharing their stories, educating others,
Right.
that's a great place to start.
So amplifying their voices, making sure they're not forgotten.
Exactly. And, supporting organizations working on the ground, providing humanitarian aid, advocating for the Rohingya, that makes a real difference too.
Okay.
And don't underestimate the power of holding our own governments accountable.
Right. Putting pressure on our own leaders
Yeah,
to take a stronger stance against Myanmar and to support the Rohingya.
exactly.
It sounds like even small actions can add up.
They absolutely do. Don't underestimate your voice. Even small actions, when they're combined with others, they can create a powerful movement for justice and change.
It's a reminder that we're not powerless, that we can all do something. This deep dive has been incredibly informative, but also, honestly, pretty heavy.
Yeah.
What are some of the key takeaways you hope people walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway for me is that the Rohingya crisis is a multifaceted tragedy. It's about historical persecution, systematic discrimination, and just unimaginable violence.
Right.
But it's also about resilience.
The resilience of a people determined to survive, to maintain their culture, to hold on to hope, even in the face of such adversity.
Exactly, and their stories need to be heard. We can't turn away from this.
Yeah,
We can't let them be forgotten.
you're right. It's about acknowledging their humanity, their right to a future, free from fear and persecution.
Yeah.
It's about demanding justice and accountability.
It's about recognizing that the Rohingya crisis is not just a regional issue. It's a global concern that demands our attention, our empathy, and our action.
Well said. This has been a really powerful deep dive. Thank you for helping break it all down for us.
It's been my pleasure.
I think we've all learned a lot.
I hope our listeners are inspired to learn more and to take action. The Rohingya people deserve our support, and their story is a reminder that we can't be complacent in the face of injustice.
Absolutely. To everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Rohingya crisis.
Thanks for listening.
It's a complex and heartbreaking issue, but one that deserves our attention and our action. Let's all do our part to ensure the Rohingya people are not forgotten and that justice prevails.